My son came back with 4 excavators demanding the inheritance, but I prepared a surprise for him. The noise arrived before any warning. 4 enormous yellow machines kicking up dust on the horizon as if they were coming to swallow everything in their path. And there in the middle of that field of dry grass and cracked earth, a man in a cap and plaid shirt stood still, watching. He didn't run. He didn't shout. He just stood there, his eyes fixed on the dirt road, waiting. He knew this day would come. He just didn't expect it to come like this. His name was Arthur. 56 years lived on that piece of ground. Son of a farmer, grandson of a farmer, a man who knew every inch of that property the way a man knows his own face. The soil there was red and parched in the summer and turned heavy as clay in the winter. He had learned to read the weather by the smell of the morning. He had buried dreams there and watered others. He had watched his family grow and then shrink, as happens with all families. His son's name was Caleb. 31 years old, navy blue suit, hair styled with that Chicago look, like a man who'd just walked out of an important meeting. And he had. Except the meeting wasn't with relatives or childhood friends. It was with a group of businessmen who had their eyes on the Shenandoah Valley, where Arthur's family had lived for 3 generations. Caleb got out of the car before the driver even cut the engine. He crossed the field toward his father without looking away. There was something in his posture, too rigid, shoulders locked, that said he had been preparing for this for a long time, or that someone had spent weeks preparing him. "Dad," he said when he got close. Arthur didn't answer right away. He looked at his son. He looked at the 4 machines parked behind, engines rumbling, dust still drifting in the hot air. He looked at his son again. "Caleb." Just one word, but loaded with everything. "I need you to sign some documents, sir," Caleb said, pulling a beige folder from under his arm. "We can settle this peacefully, or it can get more complicated. The choice is yours, sir." Arthur looked at the folder. He didn't reach for it. "Since when do you talk to your father like that?" Caleb looked away for a second. Just 1 second. Then he came back with the same firmness as before. "Since I realized this land has a value you never wanted to acknowledge, you stayed here standing still while the world moved on. I brought the people who will actually develop it." Arthur said nothing. He lowered his eyes to the ground, and that's when he did something no one expected. He slowly bent his knees and knelt in the middle of the field, not out of weakness, not like a man begging for mercy. It was something else. It was as if he needed to be closer to that land before saying what he was about to say. I had to pause for a moment when I learned this part. Because a father kneeling is not surrender. Sometimes it's the most powerful thing a man can do. Caleb stood motionless, watching his father kneeling on the dry ground, hands covering his face. He didn't know what to do with that image. No business meeting had prepared him for this. "Caleb," Arthur spoke, his voice choked but firm, "before you open that folder, I need to tell you something. Not about the land, about you." The story of Arthur and Caleb began, like many difficult stories, in a moment of joy. Caleb was born when Arthur was 25, and the property still belonged to his father, old Silas, a man who spoke little and worked hard, hat on his head from dawn to dusk. Caleb's mother, Martha, was a small woman with a gentle voice who liked to plant flowers along the edges of the vegetable garden and sing softly while she cooked. She had left far too soon, an illness that came on quickly and didn't leave time for much. Caleb was 12 when he lost his mother. Arthur, 37, was left alone with the boy and the land. He raised his son as best he could, with the hands he had, sometimes too hard because that was the only way he knew, other times too open because the guilt of not having been able to give his son a mother weighed on him in a way no one could see. When Caleb turned 18, he got the highest score in the region on a scholarship exam. The best business school in Chicago was offering the spot. And Arthur, who had never left the Shenandoah Valley, made a decision he didn't tell anyone about. He took out a loan using half the property as collateral. The scholarship covered most of the costs, but there were fees, materials, and housing for the first few months. He didn't want his son to have to choose between studying and eating. Caleb went, and he kept going. He stayed in the city, he got an internship, then a job, then a whole life that fit in that navy blue suit. He came back for the county fair for Christmas, sometimes not even that. The calls started to taper off. Arthur said he understood. He didn't know if he truly understood. What Caleb didn't know was that the loan had been left behind, that Arthur had paid it all off with years of hard work, down to the very last cent, and that during all that time he had also paid with his son's company. Dear listener, if you're enjoying the story, go ahead and leave a like, and most importantly, subscribe to the channel. It really helps us who are just starting out. Now, continuing. Arthur's sister, Beatrice, was 68 years old and had a tongue that never asked permission to speak. She lived 2 miles from the property, in a little yellow house she had renovated herself after retiring. Every week she showed up at her brother's house with a pot of something and an opinion about everything. She was the kind of woman who keeps stories close to her chest like playing cards, knowing the right moment to play each one. That afternoon, when the excavators arrived, Beatrice was there. She had arrived earlier than usual, as if she knew something was coming. She saw Caleb cross the field. She saw Arthur kneel down. And then she stepped off the porch of the old red brick house and walked toward her nephew with a calm that only years can teach. Caleb. He turned around. And for a moment, the young man in the suit disappeared. In his place appeared the 12-year-old boy she had embraced in a moment of great pain, without fully understanding what he was losing. Aunt Beatrice, do you know how much your father paid for you to study? Caleb took a deep breath. The scholarship covered everything. Do you know, or do you think you know? She asked, without raising her voice. Because there's a huge difference between the two. She opened the purse she was carrying and pulled out a yellowed envelope, one of those thick ones that had passed through many hands. Your father asked me to keep this 5 years ago. He told me that if you ever came back with a lawyer and papers, I should give you this before any signature. Caleb looked at the envelope. Then he looked at his father, who was still kneeling in the field, head down. What is this? Open it and see. Inside the envelope was a set of carefully organized documents, receipts for a loan, payment records, month after month, for 7 years. A letter from the manager of Farmers Trust Bank confirming that the debt had been paid in full. And underneath it all, a sheet of notebook paper folded in 4, with the crooked handwriting of someone who doesn't write much but when they do, puts everything into it. Caleb unfolded the paper. It was short. It said, Son, I paid off that loan gladly. I never regretted it. You left and that hurt, but it was my fault too because I never knew how to ask you to stay. This land isn't worth what you think it's worth. It's worth more. But not the way you're thinking. When you want to understand, I'll tell you the rest. Arthur. Something changed in Caleb's face. A rigidity that had been there for months, maybe years, began to crack at the edges, slowly, like dry clay that the rain starts to soften. But the day was still far from over, and the machines were still rumbling in the background. I don't know about you, but when I read that letter, I couldn't go on for a while. There are simple things that land on your chest and stay there. That short note said more than a lot of long conversations. What Caleb hadn't told his father, and what Martha didn't know, was what was behind those excavators. It wasn't just ambition, it was pressure. In the last 2 years, he had partnered with an investment group led by a man named Mr. Sterling, early 40s, expensive suit, easy smile, the kind of person who makes you feel special until the moment you realize you were being used. Mr. Sterling had shown Caleb projections, spreadsheets, an entire future built on top of that valley. An agro-industrial complex, real money, a different life. And Caleb, who had always carried deep in his chest the guilt of having left and never given anything back to his family, had seen there a way to finally be someone other than the son who abandoned his father. He was going to be the man who turned what his father left behind into something great. Except Mr. Sterling hadn't explained everything. He hadn't explained that some of the investors had questionable reputations. He hadn't explained that the contract Caleb was about to sign had clauses that practically handed over total control to him in any situation with problems. And he hadn't explained that there were other properties in the valley in sight, and that Caleb's name would be used as the gateway to everything. Caleb wasn't a bad man. He was a man who wanted to get things right and had gotten it right in the wrong place. Back at the farm, he stood looking at his father kneeling with the paper in his hand and felt something he couldn't quite name. It wasn't shame. It was something deeper than that. "Dad," he said for the second time that day, but with a completely different voice from the first. Arthur looked up. "Get me up from here." The old man reached out his hand. Caleb took 2 steps and grabbed his father's hand. He helped him to his feet, and when the two of them stood face to face with the orange sky and the 4 machines stopped in the background, neither of them said anything for a while. It was Arthur who broke the silence. "I need to show you something inside the house." What Arthur had prepared wasn't a small surprise. He had spent months organizing everything, with help from Mr. Miller, a neighbor who had become almost family in recent years, and a local lawyer who knew the region's land laws well. On the living room table, covered by an embroidered tea towel, were 2 sets of documents. "This one here," Arthur said, holding up the first, "is the registration that turned this property into a Valley Rural Cooperative, done 2 years ago. It's not mine alone. I divided it with 8 families in the valley who depend on this land to live. No one can buy, sell, or demolish anything without the agreement of all the members." Caleb stood still, looking at the page. "And this one here," Arthur continued, picking up the second set, "is what this land is going to become. Not an industrial complex, an agricultural school farm, with support from a family farm development foundation that I spent 3 years negotiating. It's going to create jobs. It's going to teach technique. It's going to stand for a long time after I'm no longer here to take care of it. And it's going to be in the name of who it should always have been in." He pushed the second document toward his son. At the top, Caleb read the name of the cooperative that would manage the project, and in the field designated for the legal representative of the founding family was his name. Caleb Arthur Harrison. He hadn't signed it, not yet. Arthur had left the space blank on purpose. "I never knew how to ask you to stay," Arthur said in a low voice, "but I learned that asking someone to stay doesn't work. You have to give them a reason to want to." Aunt Beatrice was standing at the living room door, her apron still tied around her waist and her eyes shining. Caleb looked at the name printed on that document. He read it again. He stood there, in a silence that said too much. But before any decision, there was an issue that needed to be resolved. "And Mr. Sterling?" he asked. "The investment group. I have commitments with them." Arthur pulled out a chair and sat down. "Mr. Miller told me about him 3 months ago. When you first called me about those so-called partners interested in the property, I started looking into it with the lawyer." He paused for a moment, gathering his words. "The contract you were about to sign had a serious problem, Caleb. A clause that gave the group the right to use the property's name as collateral for external financing. Without you knowing. Without you having any control over it. You were going to sign, think you were a partner, and in practice, you'd be carrying the responsibility without having any real stake in anything." Caleb stood still. "You knew about this and didn't call me?" "I did call. 3 times in the last few weeks. You didn't answer." It was true. Caleb remembered his father's missed calls. He had figured they were about everyday things, nothing urgent. He hadn't called back. He closed his eyes for a moment. When he opened them, he looked at his father with a gaze that carried years of unsaid things. "Why did you set all this up without warning me first? Why didn't you tell me about the project, the cooperative, any of it?" Arthur took a while to answer. He looked at his calloused hands before speaking. "Because I know you. You make quick decisions when you're angry or in a hurry. I needed you to get here, see it with your own eyes, feel this ground beneath your feet. One more call you weren't going to answer wouldn't have changed anything." It was hard to argue with that, because it was true and they both knew it. Dear listener, if you're enjoying the story, go ahead and leave a like and, most importantly, subscribe to the channel. It really helps those of us who are just starting out. Now, continuing. Caleb stayed on the property for 3 days. He hadn't planned it, but it just happened naturally, as if the land was pulling him to stay a little longer. On the first day, he and his father walked the boundaries of the land, and Arthur pointed out each part like someone telling a story in chapters. There where Grandpa Silas had planted the first crop. There where the family used to gather on October nights to listen to the radio. There where Martha used to love watching the day come to an end on the horizon. Caleb listened to it all in silence, hands in his pockets, his suit replaced by a simple shirt Arthur had lent him. On the second day, he sat alone at the living room table for almost an hour, the document spread open in front of him. Then he picked up the phone and called Mr. Sterling. It wasn't an easy conversation. There was pressure, harsh words, veiled threats of consequences. But Arthur's lawyer had prepared a formal response making it clear there was no signed contract, no legal obligation whatsoever. Mr. Sterling backed down, not without first saying Caleb was making a huge mistake. Caleb hung up without answering. He stood looking out the window at the field for a while after that, thinking about how many times in life we confuse what seems safe with what is right. On the third day, Caleb sat at the table with his father, Aunt Beatrice, and their neighbor, Mr. Miller. The lawyer had sent the final version of the document, everything in order. When the pen touched the paper, Beatrice clapped her hands like a child and went to get an apple pie she had made earlier, pretending to everyone that she hadn't been waiting for that moment. Mr. Miller shook Arthur's hand with a firmness that said more than any speech, and Arthur stood watching his son sign, with that expression of a man who had spent years carrying something heavy and could finally set it down. Late that night, when Beatrice had left and Mr. Miller had gone home, the two of them sat on the porch. The field outside was dark and quiet. No machines, no dust, just the sound of crickets and a sky full of stars. "I regret leaving the way I did," Caleb said, without looking at his father. Arthur didn't answer right away. "You left because I never gave you a reason to stay. It's on both of us. But I also didn't come back when I should have. You came back today." Just like that. Arthur had a way of putting the weight of things to rest with few words, the way of a man who had lived a lot and learned that life has no time for long speeches. "This agricultural school farm," Caleb said after a while, "the name you put on the document. You never consulted me." "No." Arthur smiled a little, that rare smile, the kind a man saves to give at the right moment. "It was a surprise." "Did you always know I was going to come back to sign?" "No." A pause. "But I needed to believe I would." There are times when a story tells you a truth about life that you won't find in any book. That line from Arthur stayed with me. I needed to believe I would. How many things do we hold up in life just by the strength of believing they'll work out? In the following months, the work on the agricultural school farm began, not with demolition excavators, but with local workers, new bricks, and that old little red brick house being renovated from the inside, not demolished. Caleb started making monthly trips to the Shenandoah Valley, then every 2 weeks. On one of those trips, he brought a woman named Samantha, an architect who had fallen in love with the project as much as she had with him. Aunt Beatrice approved on her first visit, with a look that needed no words. And Arthur, who for years had walked that land carrying the weight of a man who took care of everything alone, began to walk with a lighter step. Not because the problems were over. Life doesn't work that way, and he knew it well. But there was a new feeling that what he had built wouldn't disappear with him. It would go on, in the right hands of the right person. One day, while the two worked side by side in the field, Arthur in a flannel shirt and cap, Caleb with his sleeves rolled up and dirt already on his shoes, Caleb asked, "When did you decide to do all this? The cooperative, the project, the document with my name?" Arthur thought, looking at the horizon before speaking. "The day you called me saying you had some investors interested in the land. I hung up the phone and spent a while looking out at the field, and I thought, this land is going to be gone one way or another if I don't do anything. Either it goes to the wrong people, or it goes because I'll pass one day and didn't leave anything organized. So I decided I was going to leave it organized my own way. You could have told me. I could have. But you wouldn't have believed me. You needed to show up here with the machines to understand that I was ready." Caleb looked at his father for a while. Then he looked at the open field, at the sky, at the grass that the wind bent slowly. "You're a stubborn man, Dad. I know." That was a compliment. Arthur smiled, that rare smile that was slow to come, but when it came, it lit up everything around. End of the story. That was the story of Arthur and Caleb, of a father who never learned to say what he felt with words, but who spent years saying it with actions, with silence, with prepared land, and a document kept safe. And of a son who left searching for something that, when all was said and done, was waiting for him where it all had begun. If you made it this far, you know what it means to stand by someone until the end. That has value. Tell us what you thought of this story and where you're watching from. Do you think Arthur did the right thing in keeping the surprise without letting his son know? I'd love to read your thoughts in the comments. Don't forget to hit like, and most importantly, subscribe to the channel so you don't miss the next stories. Thank you so much for your company today.